No one wanted the Apache hostage at the handover until the quiet rancher took a step forward. The sun hung high over the dusty town of Redstone, its heat beating down on the square where a crowd had gathered. In the center of the town, a large group of people stood, murmuring quietly to each other as a tense atmosphere filled the air. This was no ordinary day. The Apache woman Ayanna was about to be handed over, and everyone had an opinion about what should happen next. Ayanna was led by 2 mercenaries, each holding her by the arms, through the narrow dirt street. Her face was covered with a cloth, but her posture was proud and defiant. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the crowd of townsfolk who watched her with a mix of fear, curiosity, and disdain. To many, she was nothing more than a symbol of the enemy, the Apache tribe that had long fought against settlers. At the front of the crowd, the town sheriff, along with a few local officials, stood ready to finalize the deal. The Apache woman had been captured in a raid, and now the town had to decide her fate. Some spoke of sending her to prison, far away in a city where she could be forgotten. Others suggested a harsher punishment, death as a message to any who dared cross the law. The townspeople were divided. Whispers filled the air like a storm just before the rain. Ayanna's fate hung in the balance, and no one seemed to know what the right decision was. As the crowd quieted, the sheriff raised his hand to signal the start of the exchange, but before he could speak, a figure at the edge of the crowd caught his eye. Jonah Walker, the quiet rancher, stood there, his face shaded beneath the brim of his hat. Jonah had always been a man of few words, preferring the company of his cattle and the open plains to the bustle of the town. He had not come to the square for this, but something about Ayanna's defiance, her strength despite the circumstances, drew him in. He had heard the rumors, the Apache raids, the violence. He knew the town's opinion of the natives, but there was something else here that he couldn't ignore. The sheriff's voice broke the silence, calling for volunteers to take the Apache woman, but no one stepped forward. Fear gripped the townsfolk. To them, she was a reminder of everything they feared about the Apache, a reminder of the conflict that seemed to be never-ending. Then Jonah did something unexpected. He stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust as he walked toward the sheriff. The crowd fell silent, watching him with wide eyes. Jonah didn't say a word. He simply stood there, looking at the sheriff and the Apache woman in turn. "I'll take her," Jonah said, his voice low but firm. The crowd was equally stunned. Jonah Walker was a loner. He had lived on his ranch for years, far from the town, avoiding anyone who tried to get close. Why would he want to take an Apache woman, especially one who had been involved in violence against settlers? The sheriff looked at him, a skeptical frown on his face. "You want to take her?" "She's not a pet, Walker. She's a prisoner of war." "I know what she is," Jonah said, his voice steady. "I'm not taking her to lock her up. I'm taking her to my ranch." A murmur spread through the crowd. Jonah had always kept to himself. He was a man of few words and even fewer connections. No one could understand why he would choose to help this woman, this enemy. But Jonah didn't wait for them to understand. He turned, walking away from the square without another word, and Ayanna was left to follow. The mercenaries hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly allowed her to go. The townspeople watched in disbelief as the quiet rancher led the Apache woman away, unsure of what would come next. The ride back to Jonah's ranch was long and silent. Ayanna sat on her horse, her hands bound but her posture still strong. Jonah led the way, his horse steady beneath him. The landscape stretched out before them, barren and unforgiving. It was the kind of land that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. Ayanna didn't speak. She hadn't said a word since the moment Jonah had stepped forward. She didn't know what to think of him. He was unlike anyone she had encountered before. His silence was both unsettling and comforting. Most people spoke because they were afraid of the quiet, but Jonah didn't seem afraid. He seemed at peace in the silence, as if it was where he belonged. Jonah glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of her dark eyes watching him. She was studying him just as he had studied her back in the square. There was something about her that reminded him of the wild places in the world, places untouched by people, places where only the strongest could survive. When they reached the ranch, Ayanna was led into a small cabin by the edge of the property. It was a humble place, but it was hers for now. Jonah didn't say much, but he made it clear that she would have to work to earn her place. She would help with the chores, the cooking, the care of the animals. But in return, she would not be locked away like a prisoner. She would have her freedom, as long as she didn't try to escape. At first, Ayanna resented the arrangement. She had been captured, but she was no stranger to captivity. Still, something in Jonah's quiet demeanor made her think he wasn't like the others. He wasn't a man who needed to be feared or hated. Perhaps, she thought, He was someone who could understand the weight of her past. Over the next few days, Ayanna began to settle into the routine. She helped Jonah with the ranch work, feeding the animals, mending fences, and gathering firewood. The work was hard, but it was familiar. The land was harsh, but it felt like home. Jonah didn't offer many words, but every so often he would catch her eye and give a small nod, as if acknowledging her presence. There was no judgment in his gaze. It was as though he saw her for who she truly was, not just an Apache, but a woman who had survived a life no one could imagine. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Ayanna found herself sitting by the fire outside the cabin. Jonah was nearby, tending to the animals, his silhouette framed against the fading light. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "Why did you take me in?" she asked, her voice low. Jonah paused, his back still turned to her. For a long moment there was silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. "I've lived a life of silence," he finally said, "and sometimes the silence is louder than any noise. I saw something in you, something that wasn't just Apache or settler. It was something more." Ayanna didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to hearing words like that. People didn't speak to her like that, not in the way Jonah had. She turned her gaze back to the fire, her thoughts a swirl of confusion and curiosity. Over the next few days, a quiet understanding began to grow between them. It wasn't the kind of understanding that could be spoken of easily. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Ayanna could tell Jonah wasn't like the other settlers. He didn't see her as an enemy, and he didn't judge her based on the tribe she came from. And for the first time in a long while, Ayanna felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this quiet rancher, this man of few words, could show her a different way, a way where survival didn't have to mean fighting or running, where trust could still be earned. Jonah stood by the corral, his hands resting on the rough wood of the fence. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the dry, cracked earth. He could feel the weight of the day in his bones, but there was something else weighing on his mind, something he couldn't shake. The peace they had found, he and Ayanna, felt fragile. It had been a week since he'd taken her in, and in that time, he had come to know her better. She was strong, more than he had ever expected. Her determination to survive, to not be defined by her past, reminded him of his own struggle, his own fight to survive in a world that had never been kind to him. But Jonah knew the world outside his ranch wasn't as forgiving. It never had been. That night, as the wind picked up and a chill settled over the land, Jonah heard it, the sound of horses' hooves on the dirt road. He stood still for a moment, listening, his senses sharp. The sound wasn't familiar, and that alone was enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. Ayanna was inside, preparing dinner. Jonah walked quietly toward the cabin, his boots light against the ground, and paused at the door. He peered out over the horizon, and in the distance he could see figures approaching. 4 men, riding hard, their horses kicking up dust behind them. Jonah's heart sank. He knew who they were. The men were mercenaries, hired guns who worked for anyone who could pay them. They had been part of the group that had captured Ayanna and brought her to the town. They hadn't been happy when Jonah had taken her, and Jonah suspected they would be back for her. The question wasn't if they would return, it was when. Jonah had a choice to make. He could run, he could hide, or he could stand his ground. He had always stood his ground, and this time would be no different. He wasn't going to let anyone take Ayanna from him. Not now, not after everything they had been through. He turned and entered the cabin. Ayanna looked up from the fire as he stepped inside, his expression serious. "What's wrong?" she asked, sensing the change in him. "The mercenaries are coming," Jonah said quietly. "They want you back. They won't stop until they get you." Ayanna's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Jonah had already known she wouldn't be afraid. She had faced worse than this, and she wouldn't back down now. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. "They'll have to kill me first." He admired her courage, but he wasn't about to let it come to that. The ranch, though small, was surrounded by thick brush and a steep ridge, making it hard to approach unnoticed. It wasn't much of a fortress, but it was all Jonah had, and he would fight for it. "Stay inside," Jonah said. "I'll take care of this." Ayanna opened her mouth to protest, but Jonah held up a hand. "I'll be fine. Just stay hidden. They won't know you're here." Ayanna looked at him for a long moment before nodding. Jonah could see the trust in her eyes, and it made his chest tighten. He didn't want to risk her life, but there was no other choice. If the mercenaries found her, they would take her without hesitation. He couldn't let that happen. He stepped back outside, moving swiftly to the barn where his rifle was kept. His movements were deliberate, practiced. Jonah had spent years defending his land from men just like the ones who were coming for Ayanna, but this time there was something different. He wasn't just defending his ranch, he was defending her too. Jonah climbed up to the ridge above the ranch and set up a small vantage point. From here he could see the mercenaries approaching, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust as they neared the ranch. They were riding hard, clearly in a hurry. They weren't expecting a fight. Jonah took a deep breath, steadying his aim. The wind was picking up, but he knew the distance. He'd done this before. He could take them down one by one before they even realized what was happening. The first mercenary rode into view, and Jonah squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the quiet evening. The mercenary's horse reared, throwing him off balance, but the man himself wasn't down yet. Jonah quickly repositioned, taking aim again. The second shot found its mark, sending the mercenary sprawling to the ground. The other two men cursed and spurred their horses forward, realizing they were under attack. But Jonah was faster. He moved quickly, methodically, taking out one man after another with sharp precision. He didn't miss. Finally, only one mercenary remained. He was farther back, trying to circle around to the other side of the ranch. Jonah had no intention of letting him get away. Jonah slid down the ridge, moving silently, and positioned himself near the far side of the barn. He could hear the mercenary's horse approaching, the sound of hooves growing louder with each passing second. The man was too focused on the ranch to notice Jonah moving toward him. The mercenary rode into Jonah's trap, and before he could react, Jonah sprang forward, grabbing the man's horse by the reins. The horse reared, but Jonah held tight, pulling the mercenary off balance. A sharp blow to the man's head knocked him unconscious, and Jonah tied him up quickly. With the threat neutralized, Jonah took a deep breath and looked around. The mercenaries were either dead or incapacitated. It was over, for now. He didn't have time to rest. He hurried back to the cabin to make sure Ayanna was safe. Ayanna stood in the doorway, her face calm but her eyes filled with concern. Jonah stepped inside, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It's done," he said, his voice low. Ayanna didn't say anything. She simply nodded, and Jonah knew she understood. They had won this round, but there would be others. The mercenaries were just one part of a much larger world that didn't want them to be free. Jonah knew it wouldn't be the last time they were forced to fight. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. As the night settled around the ranch, Jonah and Ayanna sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames a small comfort against the cold of the world outside. Neither of them spoke of what had happened. They didn't need to. They had both done what they had to do to survive, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in a long while, Jonah felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at something more than survival. But he knew they couldn't let their guard down. The world outside was still out there, waiting for them to slip. And Jonah wasn't about to make that mistake. The morning after the fight, the ranch was eerily quiet. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. Jonah stood on the porch, looking out over the land that had become his sanctuary. The bodies of the mercenaries had been taken care of, their horses corralled, and the danger had passed for now. But Jonah knew that the quiet wouldn't last forever. He glanced over his shoulder at the cabin where Ayanna had been inside, keeping to herself since the fight. He wasn't sure how she was handling the violence. She had been a captive, forced into a life of survival and fight. Now she was part of something different, something peaceful, at least for the moment. Jonah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Ayanna walking toward him, her movements deliberate. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple dress she had made herself. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, something Jonah admired more than he could express. "You did what you had to do," Ayanna said, her voice steady as she met his gaze. "I would have done the same." Jonah nodded. He didn't speak at first. There was no need for words between them now. After everything that had happened, they understood each other in a way that didn't need explaining. The silence between them was comfortable, and it was the kind of silence Jonah had come to cherish. Ayanna stepped closer, her eyes scanning the horizon. "What now?" she asked softly. "Are we going to keep running from the past?" The past was something neither of them could escape. It would always be there, lingering like a shadow. But Jonah wasn't ready to let it define their future. He had lived a life of running, away from people, from emotions, from everything. But now, with Ayanna by his side, he didn't want to run anymore. "We don't have to run," Jonah said, his voice low. "We can stay. We can build something here." Ayanna didn't say anything for a moment. She was still processing everything, still figuring out where she fit into this new life Jonah was offering. She had spent so many years on the run, fighting for survival, that the idea of staying in one place, of settling down, felt strange. But there was something about Jonah, something in the way he spoke and the way he had treated her, that made her believe maybe it was possible. Maybe she could start over. I don't know what that would look like, she admitted, but I want to try. It was the first time Ayanna had seen him smile like that. She wasn't sure why it made her heart swell in her chest, but it did. It was a smile that gave her hope, a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. I don't either, Jonah said, but we don't have to have it all figured out. We take it one day at a time. With that, they turned and began to walk back toward the cabin together. The sky above them was clear, the sun bright and warm. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jonah didn't feel afraid of what was ahead. He had something worth protecting now, something worth living for. That afternoon, they worked together to reinforce the ranch's defenses. Jonah showed Ayanna how to fix the fences, mend the water troughs, and care for the animals. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it gave them both a sense of purpose. There was no fear of the mercenaries now. Jonah had made sure of that. But he knew that there would always be others, always someone else out there who would try to take what was his, and he would be ready. By the time the sun began to set, they were both tired, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the work they had done. They sat outside the cabin side by side, watching as the stars began to appear in the sky above them. The land around them was quiet, peaceful even, and for the first time in a long time, Jonah felt like he belonged. The future was still uncertain, but it didn't seem as intimidating as it once had. With Ayanna by his side, Jonah knew they could face whatever came their way. Together they could build a life, a future, in a world that had always been unforgiving. As the night settled in, Ayanna turned to Jonah. I think I can get used to this, she said with a small smile.
Jonah chuckled softly.
We'll see. It's not always easy, but it's ours. Ayanna nodded. It's ours. The stars above them shimmered brightly, casting a soft glow over the land. The ranch, once a place of solitude and silence, had become something new. It had become a home. And as the night stretched on, the two of them sat together in silence, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. For the first time in a long while, Jonah felt a sense of peace. He wasn't running anymore. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. And with Ayanna, he wasn't alone. Together they would build their future, step by step, day by day, in a world that had once seemed so unforgiving. But now, it felt like home.